Shalom, everyone, and welcome to Comfortably Uncomfortable. I'm your host, Zorba. I am one of the only Alaskan-born Jews you'll ever meet. I have spent my life living in 3 different continents and telling stories for the last 20 years as a writer and director, trying to bring people together. And in our show today, Comfortably Uncomfortable, where we get comfortable talking about uncomfortable or difficult conversations, I have 2 very special panelists with me. To my left is Leah Zitter, who you'll hear more about her in a minute, but just a brief bio. She was born and raised in the Neturei Karta community in Europe, where, if you're not familiar, it's an extremist Hasidic group, but I won't say more about that, where she has since left the community and created many programs for different people who have been brought up in communities like that, or even more extremist groups like that, to de-radicalize them. And then further to my left, I have a good friend of mine, Shammai Siskind, who is a soldier in the IDF, as well as a rabbi in Nachlaot, and an intelligence professional, both within his military background as well as in his professional background. Who also has a Torah-based perspective and a frontlines perspective on the issue of the day, which is de-radicalization of Gaza, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about de-radicalization in the world in general. So without much more introduction on them, I'd like them to introduce themselves and tell us more about their life history and how it relates to our topic today. So Leah?
Thank you, Zorba. Yes, I grew up in Stamford Hill. Actually, my family directed and are leaders of the Neturei Karta movement. I have a PhD in Behavioral Neuroscience, and I work in emerging tech for companies that include Google, Amazon, and the Bill Gates Foundation.
Wow.
On the side, I use my background, my experiences, and my qualifications trying to help people like myself who come from extremist backgrounds, be they I know people who used to be Nazis, from Baha'i, from conspiracy groups, Muslim, and so forth. We try to help others de-radicalize themselves and de-radicalize their communities.
Very nice.
Former members, actually.
Sorry? Oh, yeah. Okay. And Shammai, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. First of all, Zorba, it's great to see you again in a slightly new context than the last time we were together, but we could leave that for another conversation.
Oh, well, I think we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we can hit on that maybe sometime. Okay.
Yeah.
That would be nice. So, Shammai Siskind, as you said, resident of Jerusalem. My day job is as a professional intelligence analyst. I run a consulting firm. We deal with the confluence of private industry and geopolitics. So that's what I do on a day-to-day. As you said, I do have a community in Nachlaot, very sweet, vibrant, open community in Nachlaot. So I do have that also in my portfolio, so to speak. And for the past 18 months, like many people, I've spent a lot of time going back and forth, whether it's on the southern front in Gaza or in the north in Lebanon. My main background militarily is as a combat engineer, which is where I've spent most of my time, both in the war and overall. But I did spend a number of years in intelligence roles, especially the 2 years leading up to the war. So I also have that perspective.
Nice. In fact, the first 2 times Shammai and I were supposed to meet in person, he was called into Gaza as I was about to board the bus to Jerusalem, and then the second time he was called into Lebanon. So glad we finally got to meet, and now here we are having meaningful conversations. So first, Leah, my question is to you. It's 2 parts. Number 1, maybe just tell the listeners a little bit more about what the Neturei Karta is.
Okay. My early memories are of self-taping pieces of paper to windows of my house saying, "We have nothing to do with Israel. We dislike Israel. Israel is wicked." Of course, Israel is Israel. Also, going door to door. It was my uncles. They photocopy these papers. Like if there were people who they distrusted in the community who they thought were doing bad things or so, they would send these threatening things through their doors. Growing up, there was not any restaurant or anything like that in my community, because they said in case they saw women's tongues when women were eating, this was not good. Later, I found out that some of these papers mailed through the doors that I was helping to mail would be threatening these people if any of them would establish such a structure with us. And again, I also remember one night hearing my uncles basically boast that they had beaten up this woman, say, who they thought was dressed provocatively, or this person in order to grant his wife a get. And so I grew up with much more than I remember. I did not know. I knew I grew up in a Neturei Karta family. I did not know that actually my grandfather and his brothers had started that movement in England and other parts, nor did I know that my cousins were still directing it until I was about a few months ago interviewed by the Daily Mail. And they were like conducting more research on me, on my background, and it was they who told me this.
Wow.
That's how I got to know that.
That's interesting that you just found out that you're from a founding member. But just to sort of define the Neturei Karta, so they're kind of an anti-Israel, sort of definitely anti-woman. I mean, like if you just had to quickly define what the movement is, just to clarify.
Anti-Israel, extremely anti-Israel, buddy with people that try to destroy Israel.
Okay.
Yes, I heard these stories growing up.
And do you know where that philosophy came from?
They say from Satmar. I went to Satmar school. I was partly brought up Neturei Karta, Satmar, and so when I was brought up, of course, I wasn't brought up into all its nitty-gritties. I had the regular Satmar education. I couldn't even touch a Chumash. I taught myself the Chumash from the New Testament, from the Old Testament, from the library. But later, when I made my research on it, the whole thing, frankly, seems too convoluted to me, and it doesn't seem to have, there are too many flaws in it.
And okay, so that's a perfect segue to what I want to get into, which is first, before we can talk about de-radicalizing Gaza, we got to talk about what radicalized even means. And so you've already painted a picture of your personal, I guess, experience with a radical community. But now, as a scientist and as a doctor of this, can you talk about what radicalization is in general and what a radicalized community, like what are the defining features of that?
Radicalized community, a radicalized person really believes that what they are doing is good, is holy, is what God wants. Talking from a neuro background, I would say that their brains, my brain is totally programmed just like ChatGPT or generative AI is programmed by its programmer. And all of us are programmed to some extent, but there's this programming that makes them do things that are bad and toxic to themselves, toxic to their family, to the community, to the world, but they don't realize it. And more so, they believe that what they are doing is what God has commanded and what God wants them to do. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's a very interesting approach. Okay, so now, Shammai, I'll kick it over to you for a second. So from your perspective, well, did you see any difference in the radicalization maybe between even the two wars between Lebanon and Gaza, or is that kind of the same?
No, I think that's just to answer that part directly, I think that there's a huge difference between the environments that we were and still are, to a large extent, operating in Gaza versus Lebanon. It's very, very different in terms of the population, the diversity of the population, the level of control that our adversaries have in any given area. If we're talking about the topic of radicalization specifically, I think that the radicalization that we see to our north in Lebanon or Syria is very, very low scale, let's put it that way, to anything that we witnessed in Gaza.
Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, sure. Gaza is essentially on complete ideological and geographical lockdown by the Hamas regime, and it permeates every single component of Gazan society, infrastructure, all the institutions, everything. You'll have to understand, I mean, I'm sure they've seen at this point, anyone who's interested in this topic has seen the Gaza Strip on a map and sees that it's not particularly big geographical area. So to completely control an area of that size with enough people that are ideologically committed is not that difficult, especially if you have a 20-year long span. So, I guess the way to really hammer this home, I can give you a personal anecdote. When we first went in round one, this is in November of 2023, when the ground invasions first started. To be mentioned when we first started talking, my main background in terms of army as a combat engineer, anything to do with demolitions and mechanical equipment. But for the 2 years prior to the war's beginning, so I was in an intelligence role in a brigade level intelligence assembly. So I was still very connected to that world. I immediately made a request to transfer back to a ground role. I did not want to spend the war behind the computer, but I was still very connected to people in that world. So when we were on the ground in Beit Hanun, the most northern neighborhood of the Strip, this is where all the launches and rocket fire towards Sderot come from, just to give you context. When we were there, I offered to help compile the intelligence reports that were going to assist in the operations there in the very, very beginnings, when we were just trying to find our hands and our feet, so to speak. Just looking at the raw data that was coming in at the time in our 4 or 5 block radius that we were in charge of, what our little company was responsible over, there were 40 known locations of Hamas underground infrastructure. 40. So just to give you perspective on what that means, you walk a block to your left, a block to your right, a block in front of you, a block behind you. In that area, there are several dozen known installations of Hamas terror infrastructure. And that's just the ones that we know about, not the ones that we haven't yet found out. And that happened quite a bit, as we all know. So just to give you a sense of scale of how much the Hamas influence was affecting every single corner of Gaza as a place.
Right.
And to bring this back to specifically the point of radicalization, what does that mean if every home, every school, every public facility it's almost assumed, and not out of a baseless assumption, out of observations in the field, it's assumed that they are connected in some way to Hamas infrastructure. What does that mean for the scale of radicalization? And I think it's worth pointing out that I think that our different perspectives on this topic is that while Leah, I think, if I understand correctly, deals a lot with radicalization at the level of the individual, of the psychology, of their personal experiences, of their worldview, even from the perspective of their neurology. This is really a problem that we're looking at in terms of Gaza. This is a problem of radicalization at a societal level, which I think has very different approaches and very different solutions, frankly. But I'm curious to find where there's convergence in these two worlds. When we're trying to address radicalization at scale and radicalization at the level of the individual, what can we learn from those two different perspectives?
Yeah. So
different approaches, rather.
Well, that was a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask Leah, which is, in your research, again, from your experience and from the communities and the individuals you've worked with, what are you defined radicalization really, really well. It's like that belief that this could be a destructive, philosophy, but it's God telling you to do it. Like, that's great. So then what are the contributing factors that are sort of common from the communities you've worked with and maybe even aligning with what Shammai is talking about in Gaza?
I've worked more with individuals. I see it as an individual plus an individual plus an individual plus the individual with their vortex of connections. And mine is more preventative, one can say.
Okay. So, but what are, when you are dealing with these different folks, what are, like, if you had to define, they almost always have had to deal with this, or it's, meaning what are those contributing factors that have led to that individual or that community becoming radicalized in the first place?
Often isolation. And then there's that sociological factor. Each person wants to be important. Each person wants to be important. So when you're in a small world, there's this build-up. I am more important than you, more important than you, more important than you. All this reminds me of the brain, right? Our brain basically has this inbuilt tension. On the one hand, we want to do good. We want to feel, this is the brain. It drives us to make us feel important, to do something significant in the world. On the other hand, deeply wired in the brain is the need to belong. So especially when someone is in a small, inbuilt, isolated community and there's this social pressure, and one doesn't know anything about the outside world. One doesn't even know that there is an outside world. Until I was 21, I couldn't go on a train by myself, on a bus by myself. I was told that outside this Stanford Hill, there are only people like us, only Hasidic people, because I didn't want to marry a Hasid. There are only people like us, only Hasidic people, and all the rest are either irreligious or not Jewish. And I didn't know better. So when you're brought up and I was told that I was not normal. So until I was around age 18, I was praying to God, to Hashem, to make me normal. Every day, in Shemona Esrei, by the end, please make me a normal person. Please make me normal. It was only much later that I realized that normal and abnormal depends on the community, on the environment, on the group that you live in. So yeah, I was on the scale. I was literally not normal. I was weird. I was out of balance with the environment that God had the great humor to plunk me in. But I was maybe normal or supernormal in a different group. So going back to your other question, there's also this pressure in the community. You really deeply want to belong. You want to be applauded by them. You don't want to be shunned by them.
Right.
And this also can build that extremism. And then that ties back into the other thing, that what the community tells you from your earliest age has formed your brain. So you really then believe, suppresses your amygdala, your emotions, which then again affects your prefrontal cortex, how you plan, how you make your futures. So you really do believe that, hey, you are good, you are doing something significant with your life, you are a wonderful person. And so it all connects, and that's the extremism that grows.
The common denominator of a lot of the things that you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is kind of what I'm pulling, that's coalescing from everything you're saying, that the thing that defines radicalization is a very hyper focusing on a very narrow range of facts, values, perspectives, and a disregarding of everything else. Like even geographically, the way that you described it, like growing up was everything was here in this community and everything outside was invalid, evil, in some way bad and illegitimate. And you wanted to focus only on the few square blocks in which you lived in. And also in terms of values, there's only a very narrow range of values and legitimate things that we should do and pursue, and everything else is completely illegitimate. Is that a fair assessment? This is one of the things that characterizes the radical mindset, this very narrow range of thinking.
Yes, this is our world. It's something like the book The Giver say.
Oh, great book.
This is our world. There's no other world outside the world. If you dare to think that there's another world that exists that is better than our world or more true than our world, you're wrong. So it reminds me of a true life movie that I recently saw where the CIA sponsored an asylum in Canada. They put earphones on people that on and on and on. Oh, to brainwash them. This was in the 50s. To see whether they could brainwash them into really believing untrue things about themselves. And so these were people that were like one person was depressed, but the husband wanted her to be more a quote unquote a good woman, to be more amenable as a mother and so forth. So for I think 5 or 6 hours, she had this helmet strapped on her head with the same message over and over and over again. I am going to be a good person. I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to be a good mother. On and on and on and on. That was the fabricated environment, existence that these inmates lived in. They also were not allowed out of their home. That was all they knew. The environment that I grew up in, the environment that it sounds like that you saw in Gaza. I have an ex-Hezbollah agent also. She told me very similarly the environment that she grew up in. As I said, I also worked with an ex-Nazi. Very similarly, her on and on and on and on. Our different environments are in these, like, we not only don't see the outside world, but we believe we know it. We believe that the world that we live in is all that there is, and that everything out there is inferior to, is worse than bad, actually, not worse than. Right. Bad, wrong, ours is good, ours is true.
Right. Even if it's a self-destructive or not, or just destructive mindset. And what you were saying, which is also interesting.
We don't know it's self-destructive.
Exactly. Yeah.
We think it's what God wants. It's sacred.
Well, and to your point, which is true in any group, is you always want to belong to some group, whether it's your family, whether it's your community. It's just this sort of tragic spiral because you're trying to aspire to be, applauded by a community that really is not serving you in what should be a positive goal and growth. So what I'm curious about, because we talk a lot about how do we actually move forward from this horrible war that we've been in, and that some of us are actively fighting right now. And people often liken the de-radicalization effort to like Nazi Germany. And I find that to be a very, it's a nice idea, but I don't think it really equates here, because Nazi Germany, I would consider, as horrible as the destruction was, undeniably horrible, the philosophy that led to it was what I would call more shallow than the radicalization that you're describing in Gaza, in the sense that it wasn't hundreds of years of religion based. It wasn't, decades and decades and decades. It was several years of a political and racial component that as soon as the destruction came back towards the Germans, they realized, okay, maybe this, we went way too far. Whereas it doesn't seem in this philosophy, I don't know if it's radical Islam is a appropriate term for all the radicalization happening, but to me it feels very different, and the actual process to de-radicalize seems very, very, very challenging. So before I get into the science, I'm actually curious first from your observation, Shammai, what hope or what prospect of even being possible is there from what you've seen from either Lebanon, like our immediate enemies in this war?
Hope in terms of producing what outcome?
Well, you tell me. Meaning, I don't know, because is it completely? Maybe my shorter version of what I was just trying to ask is it completely fantasy to think that we can de-radicalize Gaza to the point where we could live next to a non-Israel controlled Gaza?
I don't think that there's any realistic possibility of having a situation in which we're living next to a Gaza that does not have any Israel input in terms of control.
Okay.
And I'll expand on what I mean by that. The cornerstone or the basis of Israel's strategy for a long time in terms of dealing with the, let's say, radical elements within the Palestinian population. I'm using words that people might object to, but just for the sake of conversation, without having to unpack every single term that I'm using, this is the language I'm going to stick to for right now. The basis for that strategy has been essentially compartmentalization. Keep the problem away. Disengage. That's actually probably the best word to use. In fact, as we know, 20 years ago, there was an operation. There was a decision, a political, strategic decision of disengaging from the Gaza Strip. And that's actually a very, very good way of describing it. It was, we don't want to have to directly be involved with this problem. We want to move the problem away. One could even argue that that ideology is what fueled Oslo. It wasn't necessarily a recognition that, oh, these are peace-loving people and we'll just give them a chance. I think that there was a lot of recognition, perhaps not as much today, but a lot of recognition that, you know, not everything is as pleasant on the other side as we would like it, as we would like it to be. But it was fueled by this idea that we don't want to and we can't engage with the problem hands-on. We need to separate ourselves from the problem. We need to hand over the problem to a Palestinian Authority, to a third party actor. We can't directly engage with the problem. Now, what that's produced is that we built a big wall, both literally and strategically, to pretend that the problem was pushed aside, when really all we were doing was allowing that problem to fester and putrefy to a point that it, again, literally and strategically, blew up in our face eventually. Mm-hmm. The disengagement from Gaza allowed that entire area to become a radicalized hub that produced a generation of sociopaths. And even though that is not our fault, I think it's all incumbent upon us to take an honest look at what that decision produced. The minute that we disengage from something, I think we can wrap this whole thing up into just one sentence. The minute that Israel fully disengages from something and tries to offload the problem in a complete way, it produces very, very bad results. Destructive results, not just for us, but anyone that's living in those areas that we disengage from. It just produces horrible, horrible outcomes for them. Horrible. And I can sit here as someone who's fought in Gaza, who continues to fight in Gaza. I can recognize that there are people in Gaza that are suffering for much, much longer. Let's not say worse or less. They're suffering a lot because of the fact that Israel chose to disengage from there. Is that their fault? Do they have responsibility for that? Absolutely, there's responsibility. There's responsibility on all sides. But I'm saying, just as a fact, the moment that Israel decides to disengage fully from a certain place, it brings very, very bad outcomes to everyone involved. So the most responsible thing, the most humane thing, the most stable thing in terms of long-term outcomes is our is our involvement at one level or another in both Gaza. We don't have to get into a whole conversation about the West Bank and different areas, but basically every area that Israel has a stake in, we need to maintain that connection and involvement in. Because if we don't, it's going to devolve in this. It will devolve in the same way that Gaza devolved.
Right. That's a tough pill to swallow.
I'll concretize this in a few examples just to make this as real as possible for people. You know, as we all know now, the education system in Gaza was completely run by the Hamas regime, and was utilizing UN resources as tools. UNRWA famously was the biggest perpetrator in that whole thing. That means that there was basically a machine, a large infrastructure that was fueling this radicalization for the better part of 20 years. And we allowed that to happen. We allowed the funding to continue. We allowed the situation to remain as it was, even though we knew what was going on, hoping in some abstract way that it could just continue on like that forever. If you allow the radicalization machine to continue on without disrupting it, what outcomes do you think are going to be produced?
Right.
I mean, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who witnesses these outcomes. If we just put two and two together and see, well, all of the messaging that this entire generation has received from the moment that they're born has been this. It's been packaged in this way with these interests backing it. These are clearly the outcomes that are going to be produced. And this is why it's not just that we have the right or an excuse to do it. It's also our responsibility to do it. When you look at it from that perspective, it's our responsibility, since we're the only ones that can really do anything about it. There's no one that can actually influence the situation in a positive way other than us. And we have to really internalize that fact. And from that place, we're able to act in a way that can bring some long-term change over here. The very, very first thing to go is the education infrastructure. Absolutely, there's no question that the very first thing is the education infrastructure, which needs to be put. It needs to put a hard stop to that. There's already been steps in terms of UNRWA, as I'm sure the viewers and listeners might know. There's been actions by the Israeli Knesset to largely limit, if not completely take out, the UNRWA influence from the country, and hopefully that will continue, because that is the only way that we can have a path forward. It's the engagement, it's the ownership, it's the recognizing that the only one that really has the ability and the interest in making sure that this is healed and restructured in a positive way is us.
So interesting. I'm curious now, Leia, listening to that and hearing, I guess, the scale and the depth of the radicalization here. Let's say we change the educational system there. What are from the scientific and the programming standpoint, what are the other methods that would need to happen and could be done to start to move in that direction?
Give an example by asking you. I'll answer your question by asking you something.
Okay.
Let's say if I ask you, if I tell you that the fact that coffee dehydrates you, have you heard about that?
Yes.
Well, it's a myth, because when you think about it, coffee is made of 99% of water. Yeah? How do you feel about that?
Right.
I mean, do you feel triggered by that?
I mean, I don't drink coffee, but no. I understand what you mean. Is you're saying,
Just do you feel, or I can now ask you this, contrast to this thing. I'll tell you that, you live in, I'll tell you that, Tel Aviv, in my opinion, is a place full of prostitutes. Israel actually does apartheid, and you're living in a very bad place. Or I could tell you that Mother Teresa is a bad woman.
right.
Which one do you think triggers you more, or would trigger someone more? Which statement? The one about coffee, or this other one about...
Probably Israel being an apartheid state, or Tel Aviv. Yeah.
Why?
Because it's more pertinent to my life, and it's more of a judgment on a character versus the impact of a particular compound.
But so what if it's more pertinent to your life? You're getting closer, but so what?
It's there. To me, I think there's a gaslighting element where someone is telling you something about you that you know to not be true, but they're saying it about you. And therefore, if you're talking about coffee, even if I was a huge coffee fan, it's still ultimately about something I drink. It's not about me as a person. But if you're saying, Zach, you're or Zorba, you're a racist, but I'm not a racist, you're saying something that's a negative aspect of my character that is not true, and you're the one who's determining that.
I'm not saying that about you. I'm saying that about Israel. And in that, therein lies. It actually lies the answer. You see, when you were brought up, when all of us were brought up, our brains from the very beginning were programmed by our groups, the environments that we were brought up in.
Yes.
A lot of the stuff poured into there was neutral, like let's say, oh, coffee will dehydrate you. It's good to brush your teeth and so forth.
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff was also that this is the way to live. This is who the group that you are part of. This is what's going to happen to you in the future. This is where you came from. This is what is true. This is what is false. This is what is good. This is what is bad, and so forth. These things were reiterated. These messages were reiterated over and over through rituals, through norms, through suffering, through music, through intensity, over and over and over. Every time you do something that the group considers good, you feel pleasure, dopamine in the brain. It gives you pleasure. You love it. Every time you do something that the group considers bad, they shun you, they punish you, you're sent in the corner, say, when you're a child. You're beaten, say, later on. And again, your brain feels pain,
Right.
deep pain. So, in other words, these reiterated messages, they go deeply into your brain. It's called deep culture. They penetrate each and every aspect of the brain to the point that you no longer can make a difference between the group, in this case, the country that you grew up in, when I said Israel or Tel Aviv, and between yourself. So like in the example that you just gave, I never called you a racist.
Right.
I condemned Tel Aviv and Israel, but your brain naturally, my brain naturally, everyone's brain naturally. And when people are brought up in an extremist group, in a fundamentalist extremist place, like let's say Gaza, they identify so much with the group that they're brought up in that they're ready to give their lives for it. Again, the ex-Hezbollah agent that I knew, she told me when she was age 6, between ages 6 and 10, she remembers having these discussions with her cousin about who is going to do the Shaheed first. We're both going to be martyrs. Great. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to do it. They would this was their ambition. They identify themselves so much with the group that they can't make a distinction between themselves and groups. So now let's go back. Let's go back to say we do change the education paradigm. And here's the student, the educational paradigm. The teacher is someone who is, quote, other from a society outside. She or he has their ideas that were programmed into their brain from their environment. This one from Gaza deeply sees, is told that this one is the other. If we have any connection with the other, not only are we going to be contaminated ourselves, as I thought, but our community is going to shun us, throw us out, as a radical Muslim, likely kill you. So no, there's no way I'm going to be affected by them.
Right.
And they're wrong. Aside from which they believe they're wrong, aside from which they so deeply believe that if we listen to them or are affected by them in any way, we forfeit paradise. We go to hell.
Right.
So that's how I see it from my experience and from speaking to many similar others from many similar backgrounds as myself.
So then I guess that kind of leads into another very hotly debated topic, which I think can be talked about from what you might call a modern philosophical standpoint and a Torah standpoint, which if they're so deeply, if the Hamas infrastructure and the hatred and the radicalization is literally underneath every building, meaning it's the foundation, it's part of the soil. What is an innocent Gazan, and what is then the role? You're saying like we have a role and responsibility. So what does that look like in terms of trying to make improvements and then dealing with the very real like lives on the ground for soldiers, for civilians, etc. So I'm curious, maybe from the military, but also just from the human standpoint, how do we approach that? Whoever wants to start.
I can take that one. I think that these philosophical questions of what is an innocent Gazan, what is an innocent bystander, what's legitimate collateral damage, the questions are phrased in a way that's not helpful. They're not helpful because they're phrased in the way that two college students at 2 a.m. after the third beer would be talking about something. They're not addressing the real world in any constructive way. I think that the way that these things need to be approached is, what are the outcomes that we need to achieve? What are the outcomes that are just in achieving? And what do we need in order to achieve them? It is a reality, as we were saying until now. The entirety of Gaza has been leveraged and manipulated by the Hamas regime over the past 2 decades. That is a fact. Whether we're going to look at how much underground infrastructure is under every building, whether we're going to look at it from the institution's perspective, from any perspective that you want, the entirety of that place has been fully leveraged by that regime. What is the percentage of the people that fully buy into the Hamas ideology and actively participate in the Hamas ideology? I think that this is somewhat of a red herring. It's not a constructive question. Are you familiar at all, Leia, with the statistics behind, assessing Nazi Germany and how many were hard believers and how many were
Very hard to know.
Right. This is a topic that I actually have some interest in, because even scholarly estimates, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the highest is like 15% were hardcore believers.
You can't really know.
You can't really know?
Because there are so many variables over there. First
That's
of all,
true.
there's what
That's
people
true.
say, and that may not be true. That may be true.
We could just look
It's
at it from
also-
like the numbers. So, by the end of the war, there were less than 1 million card-carrying SS members. Less than 1 million. That was out of a population of 80 million people. Even the people that were card-carrying Nazi party members was less than 9 million. Less than 9 million people. That's also like around 10% of the population. Even the people that voted in the elections, as we know, that has many variables, as you're saying, different variables. Like people can vote for different parties for a wide variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. It was less than the majority of the country. The last open free elections in Germany, less than a majority. I think it was like 43% or something. In 1933, voted for the Nazi Party. That's it. Mm-hmm. So what are we going to say? Are we going to say, well, it's only that compartmentalized part of the society that we have a problem with, the rest is okay? That is the wrong way of looking at the problem. During those years of World War II, and as hard and as heavy as this is to realize, the world did not have a Nazi problem. The world had a Germany problem. A Germany problem. Because all of those radicals, whether it was 1% or 30% or 40%, it doesn't matter. That percentage of the population was able to impound the entire national infrastructure, the institutions, the infrastructure, the resources, the population. They were able to do that. Mm-hmm. How they were successful in doing that, that's a very interesting question, but it's irrelevant. Once you realize that that's the situation, you need to contend with that situation. You need to contend with that reality. And that is the reality that we have here. So talking about innocent, not innocent, these are like big, heavy terms that I think they're not constructive. The question is, what are the outcomes that are just and right in achieving? And I think that clearly any objective observer of the situation knows that the just and proper outcome that we're trying to achieve is to dislodge the control that Hamas has over a long, long time managed to have over every aspect of the Gaza Strip, whether it's the physical territory or the resources, and that needs to be dislodged. People look at these, aerial drone pictures of the scale of destruction in Gaza, and it's often used as ammunition against Israel to say that, it's disproportionate. There's no reason to do that. They're doing it just for the heck of it because they find it fun to destroy things. This is completely not true. You have to understand the level of how much the Hamas regime permeated every single part of Gaza, the physical and institutional level, and this is the goal that needs to be done. This is the goal that needs to be achieved, and anything that it as heavy and as sorrowful as it is, any steps that we need to undertake in order to achieve that outcome of dislodging Gaza from the grips of this terror infrastructure, that is what must be done. It must be done. Otherwise, there is no lasting peace for Israel, and there's definitely no lasting peace for the population of Gaza.
It's interesting. You made me think of, I hosted a former Hamas member. I told Leia about it for a Shabbat dinner when I was still in LA. He had never been to a Shabbat meal. He was what I would consider like in the Hamas Kollel. He was not like in the active fighting brigade, but he really, he had this. He would hug every Jew. I mean, he would like hug a Jew, and then he would say, "I'm sorry about October." Like he had this, and like every one of his emotions was like the most extreme emotion you could have at any given moment. And then I remember sitting with him. We were having dinner, and I was like, "Well, what is like when we say Hamas is everywhere? Like, what does it mean?" And he was saying, his teacher in school was part of Hamas. Then afterwards, you would leave school, and there'd be some Hamas march, and this is this is probably very early, like right around the disengagement time, and so you go out and they give you, flags and banners, and you go, and then at the mosque they like pull you in to learn. So he's like, to me it was just, I think of like growing up with NCSY or like Jewish youth groups, and okay, we might have gotten into some trouble here and there, but it wasn't like, we weren't going like just being told, going back to your definition of radicalization, which is like, this is the way. Yes. Everything else is, not just not okay. It's bad. It's evil. It's going to bring you further from, heaven and salvation and all those things. And understanding that. And then as I'm meeting this guy, as he's having such a huge revelation in his life, he still had this very strong suicide mindset to him, where he goes, well, hopefully my son will finally be okay and he'll have a job, and then I can like leave this world. And I was like, that's when you want to enjoy it shows how you're talking about the programming and the conditioning. And this is a guy who was born in America too, and he just lived in the West Bank, and I think, Shammai, just to wrap up some of your points, is we do have, it may not be our fault, but the responsibility, if we want to have a practical solution, I think starts with even just understanding all the things you've talked about, is just how deep the infrastructure is, how that impacts the mindset, to all the things you've been saying. And I have a couple questions to sort of bring this conversation, even though we could talk for 3 more hours, to a close. So one, I want to talk from the Torah perspective, because you reframed my poor framing of the innocent Gazan thing, which I agree with you about. We've talked a lot, Shammai, you and I, about the inevitability of Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, and all that it's part of our existence. So if it's inevitable, and also thinking about the idea of Amalek, I'm curious, and I'm not putting my opinion on this. Do we in the modern time have a definition of where Amalek applies? And if so, does that relate to this sort of inevitable spiral? To me, what was very clear and such a gut punch in this war was seeing a Holocaust survivor being kidnapped into Gaza. Because it's like, you just think we're not going to see that in our lifetime. Like, they've survived Nazis, and now they might be back in it. So I'm curious, from a Torah perspective, both the question of inevitability, but also the Amalek as it applies in the world, if it does at all.
So I'll just address that first point about the Holocaust survivor being dragged into Gaza, because I think that this is a comparison that we've seen from the beginning of the war, even until now, that is not helpful for us. The comparing of what we experienced on October 7th to what we experienced 70, 80 years ago in Europe. The most Jews killed since the Holocaust, things like that, comparing our experience now to what was there several decades ago. I don't think this is constructive. And the reason that I don't think it's constructive is because it's a radically, radically different set of circumstances. We're in a different place, the world is in a different place, and practically how we respond to the challenge is extremely, extremely different. This is something that I would never have the gall to say such a thing, but because I heard it from someone who experienced the horrors of that period of history during the Nazi slaughter, I think it's a powerful thing to at least consider. This was someone who participated in the Yom HaAtzmaut ceremony last year. If people don't know, they have the torch lighting ceremony every year as Yom HaAtzmaut comes in on the night of Yom HaAtzmaut. And I'm paraphrasing over here. But this person basically said to a certain extent that, for me, the response to October 7th healed a lot of my trauma from the Holocaust. Now, that's a heavy statement.
Yeah, maybe dive into that.
But I want to unpack that just a little bit.
Yeah.
Not saying that now that we responded to October 7th, it makes everything okay, or we can forget about it. That's not what's being said. What's being said is something a little bit more subtle, but deeply important. During the experience of the Holocaust, the Jewish people were basically passive. We didn't have the ability to do anything. Our response to that, and I've had the privilege of meeting many people who survived that experience. The response was maintaining throughout the will to survive, which was not a given to live through that experience and maintain the will to survive. And people did that. People went through unimaginable horrors and maintained the will to survive. And even more, once they went through the experience, they went and said that their revenge, their response is going to be to build. People that went through years of torture and pain and lost their entire families and came to Israel or came to North America and built institutions and built hospitals and vibrant communities, that was their response. That was the challenge of that generation, to maintain the will to survive and then to rebuild afterwards, which is not something that I can even begin to relate to, that challenge. But the challenge that we have now it's not a better or worse, it's a different challenge. Very different challenge. And the fact that we were not forced into responding in a passive way to that type of violence, but rather we had the ability, and again, the responsibility to respond in a completely different way, that is a real shift that people need to pay attention to, that feeds into the point that we were making before about it really is our responsibility. It's not our right that we have the right to self-defense. Obviously, we have the right to self-defense. Every individual human being has the right to self-defense. I'm talking about it's incumbent upon us, because we have the ability, because we have all of the resources and the situations and the circumstances that we have, it's incumbent upon us to respond in this way, to take ownership over the situation. The Amalek question, suddenly all the anti-Semites in the room are Talmudic scholars and biblical scholars, and they know everything about everything, and they know, Amalek, they're using as this excuse to genocide. We'll just say off the bat that I have not come across anyone in all of my experiences and going in and out of Gaza and Lebanon and every other place that believes that we have a religious obligation to kill every man, woman, and child in Gaza. Just to put that off the bat. I have not met anyone, and if there are people with that belief, they're definitely not in positions of influence and certainly not making decisions for the country. So we'll just put that on the side for a second. However, the whole ethos and archetype, let's say, of Amalek is definitely one that is very, very strong in our history, in our national story, and is something that we need to pay attention to. And as some of the listeners may know, remembering those events is something that we do as a collective mitzvah, as a collective practice annually. We remember that. So what are we remembering? Are we remembering the fact that there are people that don't like Jews? And if that's the case, why is Amalek unique than any other nation that causes problems? And the Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, and the other, slew of people that have caused us problems throughout the generations. I think that there is a very, very clear definition of Amalek, and it needs to be put on the table, and people need to recognize what this is. There is a spirit in the world that exists in which people identify, they self-identify as the people that are meant to bring an end to the Jewish people. I'll say that one more time. There are people that their self-identification is, I am the guy that destroys the Jewish people. And that gives all of the meaning and purpose and direction in their life, individually and collectively. And the reason why this concept is so hard for people to wrap their heads around is because I don't think that there's any other example of this. In all the annals of human history with any other nation, there is no other example of someone who identifies as, I'm the guy that destroys the other guy. There's no such example. And if we look, the reason why this idea, this spirit is so much equated with Nazi Germany specifically, it wasn't just the horrors and the scale of murder. It wasn't just that. It was because the Nazis as a group, and certainly the leader of that movement, identified as we are the guys that destroy the Jewish people. That's what we do. People might not know this piece of very, very important trivia. The last thing that Adolf Hitler, the last message that he gave over to the world in his bunker as the Russians were closing in on Berlin, the very last thing that he wrote was a statement basically saying, again, I'm paraphrasing here, I have done everything in my power through my leadership of Germany to put an end to the Jewish scourge in the world. I've tried as best as I can. Now I'm signing off. That was his last message to the world. Not like, listen, we tried, we had a good fight, and all the soldiers did a good job, and honor to you. And no, we did it. I tried as hard as I could to put an end to the Jewish problem. That was his final sign off to the world. And we could see that this spirit does in fact exist to this day, embodied by, unfortunately, not a few organizations, but just sticking to what we're talking about now. The Hamas Charter doesn't talk about their visions for a flourishing society and their want to bring, goodness and wealth and education to their children. No, it talks about their desperate desire to destroy the Jewish people, and not Israel, the Jewish people, wherever they are. That's how they self-identify. So when we talk about the spirit of Amalek, that is a real thing. And we need to recognize at any level that you want to recognize it, at a psychological level, at an emotional level, at a spiritual level, whatever level you want to analyze it, this is a reality, that there is a self-identification as I am the guy that brings an end to those people. That's what it is. And we need to recognize that. It needs to be integrated into our approaches to the world, to our policy decisions. It needs to be recognized as the reality that it is.
It's interesting. I think, you point out the dual responsibility and the ability of recognizing that the hatred is very real and unique towards, against us as Jews, but also that we are in a different place than we've ever been historically to actually counter it and fight it, whether it's, from a more just putting out the right message or actually tactically on the ground. And also, I just thought it was fascinating how we started with your definition of radicalization, and even up to your summation of Hitler's last moment, he's literally saying with the definition is, I've done everything I possibly could. Please recognize that I've been doing the right thing. I just couldn't get, all the way to my goal. And that's how radical he truly was. So I think my last question to you, Leah, for this discussion is, if we've talked about the methods of radicalization, and in some ways it doesn't seem so difficult. And in today's world, especially with algorithms where you're basically put in your own echo chamber of ideas, not based on accuracy, not based on, certainly not, being a good person, but just how to engage and even traumatize people more and more to keep coming back to whatever messaging they're being fed. So if people can get so easily radicalized in one direction, how can we reverse radicalize?
We can.
And so, I would love to hear your thought on that.
Are you ready for a long story?
This is the grand finale. Bring it.
Okay, so as said, when I was brought up, even from very young on, I was told, my parents, my mother in this case, really seemed to believe that I had a bad spirit in me. I was always called, you're not normal, you're bad, because I was asking questions. The principal of my seminary, he told me that Hashem gave me a man's brain, and my mission in life is to suppress it. because I was always asking questions. So one of the things
I'm laughing with you, not at you, Leah. I'm laughing with you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I don't care even if you laugh at me.
Is that a backhanded compliment to have a man's brain?
I was asking questions. Too many questions. I was not allowed in a seminary where
Right.
we didn't study things. We disemboweled chickens in the classroom, for instance, and we were just told how to be a good wife and a good mother. That was it. So one of the things that was done to me was I was put out on the street late at night. This was even before I was a teenager. So that's where I slept in the library, or I slept in phone boxes. But either way, in the library, that's where I can't sleep in the library. So I started browsing through the books, reading. And I wanted to know how I could know that what I was taught was true. So I started reading, I read the Old Testament. Couldn't touch the Torah in school. Read the Old Testament, read Darwin, read the Unishot, whatever. One of the other punishments that was done for me was I was at least for a year in my grandmother's attic. Away from everyone, isolated there, and every so often my uncles with their strummels from Belgium would come. I'd have to go down to the dining room, and they'd speak to me, and they would tell me how I have to be good. I'm not going to get shidduchim. I'm not going to allow my siblings to marry. On and on, how I should be a good person. Anyway, in my grandmother's attic, not much to do there. I'd look out the window, and I'd see these different groups of people there. Like there were these. They had their tennis rackets, and so they were evidently Christians. They were these with hijabs, pants, and so evidently Muslims. And firsthand, I would pretend that I call myself Lady Moshe, meaning I pretend I was Moshe's wife or so, and that I would make a new group, and I would make commandments, and this is how I would make my group. Everyone would sit around the table and question each other and be good to one another and so forth and so forth. And one day I was imagining, okay, let's say these people out there, they're like these paper dolls that you can cut out stuff. So you put the hijab on this person, you give this person a gun instead of the other. And so as they're brought up, that's how they become. And then I'm thinking these people, like, they're brought up all their lives to follow this God, to do these things, to marry this person, to educate their children in this way, and that's how they live until they die. And what if they're wrong? And then I'm thinking, hey, I'm brought up also in a similar way. This is right. This is how I should spend my money. This is what I need to eat. This is how I need to daven, and this is what I need to do to the God, that I believe in. What if I'm wrong? How do I know? So now, how can I know whether I'm right or wrong? Through my life for the next 20 or so years, I did whatever I could, read whatever I could, studied whatever I could. I got my master's in philosophy and advanced logic. I got a bachelor's in various areas of humanities, and so I got my doctorate in behavioral neuroscience. Along the way, I also had to live in different places. One of the places I lived in was in Hungary, Budapest. Now, that was a mistake. I was looking for a job in America, New York. I was not educated in geography. So when I was asked, do you want to work in Budapest? I knew there was a workplace or whatever in America and different. I said, sure. And so I find myself in Budapest, Hungary. In Budapest, Hungary, there are these Jews who became neo-Nazis because they did not know they were Jews. And so during the Holocaust, their parents wanted to prevent them from knowing that they were Jewish. So I counsel and I teach these neo-Nazis, and I'm with the different cults there. So I am involved with these different groups. I wanted to know whether I learn about the brain, and then I want to know, how does the brain think and reason? Can I intervene with that reasoning? So at that time I'm living in San Jose, so I get involved there with the San Francisco jail and Los Gatos jail and various other jails, and I counsel different parolees. Somewhere else, I counseled others on sex, even though I didn't have the therapeutic background, but all the time investigating. This is the way the brain works. Can I change that? Can I change how I have been programmed? Further on in life, I lived in Richmond, Virginia, actually in a place where there were wells, and I lived. Again, how I got to that place was I had to flee, totally escape from where I was, because my parents were trying to take my children. This was after I was divorced, my family. This was after I was divorced. They were saying I was a Muslim and I was no longer religious and so on. So the police were involved, and the police told me, change your identity, just leave, go somewhere. I had once read that Virginia was the place where cultured people live. It sounded so great to me. So I chose Richmond, Virginia, where I didn't know I was in like Neverland over there. My neighbor was of the KKK. He called me sister. He didn't know I was Jewish. I was next door to Jehovah's Witness, and another neighbor was a pastor. He was actually, I think, he said that he served Satan. So he would blow.
I don't know if you had a male brain, but you certainly had a magnet for interesting people.
He and his people, they would blow the shofar, they would blow horns, and they would bang on the walls, and they would say that they are expunging the bad spirits from each other. They would sort of sacrifice. He worked in Walmart. They would sacrifice some meat or so on the yard. But either way, I got to know those people. I was interested in knowing as many things as possible. I attended a Quakers church pretending I was one of their people. I attended and got to know some Armenians. I was in the evangelical church over there, and they're talking to me about their council. I'm saying, well, who is that? They're saying, of course, Jesus. Another pastor from a different church, he asked me to help him prepare his sermons. I mean, I was only in that part where they were all the church, and many of them were anti-Jewish or didn't know much about Jews. I didn't really divulge that I was Jewish. So wherever I was, all the time, getting to know different groups, different religions, different ways of life, and all the time inquiring, herein is how I have been programmed. Can I get out of it? One of the other things that I did, and this was what I formatted my dissertation on, was I got to know 27 so-called amazing apostates. Why are they amazing apostates? These were people that belonged to extremist faiths like I did, totally isolated, didn't know the outside world, and yet left it, said that they were wrong, reversed their beliefs. And I thought, well, if they did so, despite them losing their families, sometimes losing their children, losing everything, why did they do so? And let me see if there is a common pattern. I did discern a common pattern. It seemed to me there was a common pattern. That's why I did my dissertation on. Later, I wrote some articles on it. I was interviewed on some radio programs on it. I also published my ideas for certain newspapers and publications in Iran. I wrote for The Iranian. I wrote for Turkey's paper, on and on.
Are you able to sort of distill?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
I can. I discussed this with people who came, like the ex-Hezbollah agent. She had very similar ideas. I looked at this further in hard research. And yes, anytime people come to something something, you can't tell a person a fact. If you tell them that this, you are wrong and this is the way it is, their brain doesn't take it. They retreat back to their group and they just get angry at you. So it just brings them further away. Facts don't help. It has to be what I called an as-is moment. For instance, this is what someone who I know, he was a pastor from the Church of Christ, which is similar to Mormonism. And he says that all the time he was told that other Christians are wrong, other people are wrong. One time he was walking, and that they are cruel and so forth. One time he was walking the streets and he saw this pastor, this Christian under a bridge giving food to homeless people. And he sees, hey, this person is kind. This is not what was told to me. There's the first chink in his thing. If this is not true, then what else? Then what else? Then what else? Now, had someone come to him and told him beforehand, you know that all Christians, this is not true what you're being told, he would have negated that. It had to appear to him a phenomenological incident there in real life for him to change his mind. My friend from Lebanon, this person who used to be in the Hezbollah, she told me that she started being on the internet, in her room on the internet. And this is where she started seeing, hey, what my parents were telling me, what my teachers are telling me. This is not true. This is not true. This is not true. She says only the fact that she isolated herself for days on end was she able to take herself out from her environment, which is an important piece. You keep on getting the environment coming into you. Get yourself out. Then your brain is sort of free to start making its own cells, to start seeing different things. She said, and she started questioning. She said, however, that when she tried to convince her sister, she said her sister was really extroverted, outgoing. Anything, she said, when she tried to tell her sister, showing her sister aspects about how the Quran says this and that about against women, she said in that way she did manage to persuade her sister because her sister really cared about that. But to tell her anything about Jews, she couldn't make a dent because she was too much sunk into that. That was her role and so forth. I'm sorry if I'm talking too much.
No. So, no, I think... finish up.
So to wrap up, and yes, hard research has validated and has confirmed this. You can't show a person facts. As long as they're doing things for the community, they get the pleasure. Their brain makes them feel good. When do they not feel the pleasure anymore? When something that is distracting, discordant to that, comes to that from the outside, there's a chink in that dopamine. Suddenly they don't feel so good anymore. And that's when they start asking, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm wrong. Again, this is only a small percentage of people that I call the amazing apostates, a 1% that may have the courage to chase that, to follow that, and then to say, goodbye, everything I was taught is not true, or a lot of what I was taught is not true. I'm taking my own path. Most still want to keep to their community. But yes, I think that there could be a path to de-radicalizing people.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting because, when anyone's in a very fixed mindset in whatever direction that is, usually telling them a fact is the least, the least useful thing. And it's having an experiential moment that actually could make you, oh, wait a second, I'm not, this is not serving me, or this isn't aligning. And I think, well, I just want to say thank you to both of you for coming and discussing this. I have a lot more to say on this, but one thing that I think to end on with what you both talked about, which is in order to potentially provide more of those moments, like I always think that there's a lot of wasted energy in fighting anti-Semitism, let's say, when it comes to, especially online and all these things. I really think, and this speaks to, for sure, what Shammai's been saying, which is we're in a position of power now, and the best thing is to show not by necessarily force, but just by the strength of the Jewish people as a whole, the strength of Israel as a whole, by showing what we really are, what we really, we're not the apartheid, state that is always talked about, and to provide those experiences where we are living according to our values, other people see it. The people who take it upon themselves, like the Hitlers of the world and the Amaleks of the world, who self-identify, they may not be the people we'll reach. But if we are the way we're meant to be and living that way, those people might encounter, whether it's on the street or whatever, and see, oh, maybe the way I'm going about this is not the right way. And
Correct.
And we can make the uncomfortable a little bit more comfortable.
Correct. You summed it up so well, beautifully.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. That was really great, and we'll be talking more. So, thanks for tuning in.
Zorba, thanks so much,
everyone. See you next time.
Thank you very much.